The sky did not burn when the world ended. It simply filled with shadows so massive they swallowed the sun. Humanity had spent a century searching the stars for a sign of life, completely unaware that death had already visited our planet thousands of years ago, and it had just returned to check its work. The armada breached the atmosphere without a whisper. There were no sonic booms to shatter windows, no fiery trails of re-entry to light up the afternoon sky. 36 colossal obsidian monoliths descended from the thermosphere and parked themselves silently over every major global capital from Washington to Tokyo. The ships were sleek, frictionless, and utterly devoid of recognizable propulsion systems. They hung in the sky like executioners' blades suspended on invisible threads, defying gravity with casual arrogance. Down below, human civilization ground to a violent halt. Traffic congested into miles of twisted metal. Markets crashed into absolute zeros. Millions of people stood in the streets, paralyzed by a mixture of awe and primal terror, staring up at the belly of the abyss, deep beneath the Appalachian Mountains, sheltered behind blast doors and 3 feet of lead-lined concrete. Doctor. Elias Thorne was aggressively ignoring the panic occurring on the surface. Elias was a virologist by trade, a cynic by experience, and currently the only man inside the deepest subterranean bunker of the Centers for Disease Control still drinking 3-day-old coffee, while the Pentagon was frantically trying to lock missile trajectories onto ships that absorbed radar waves like sponges. Elias was staring at a completely different kind of screen. He was not looking at the physical mass of the vessels or calculating their potential kinetic payloads. He was tracking an erratic, pulsating energy signature bleeding off their lower hulls. It was a frequency that made absolutely no sense for a mechanical propulsion system. The data cascading down his monitors looked terrifyingly organic. The heavy pneumatic doors of the laboratory parted, admitting a rush of cold, filtered air and General Sarah Vance. Sarah moved with the kind of pragmatic, kinetic energy that demanded immediate obedience from everyone in the room. She wore her uniform like a suit of armor, her expression a rigid mask of tightly controlled crisis management. She was also Elias's former partner, a deeply complicated detail neither of them had the luxury of unpacking at the end of the world. Their relationship had ended because Sarah believed in neutralizing threats with overwhelming force, while Elias believed that the only true threats were the ones too small to shoot. Right now, the universe was forcing them to collaborate one last time. She marched straight to his console, her eyes darting across his chaotic array of biometric monitors and atmospheric telemetry charts. "The president is moving to condition red," Sarah said. Her voice clipped, devoid of the warmth he remembered from years prior. "We are trying to organize a coordinated global first response. Elias, but conventional radar is bouncing right off their hulls. Thermal imaging is useless. They run colder than the surrounding air. We are entirely blind up here. Tell me you have something useful. Tell me they have a weak point we can exploit." Elias did not look away from his screens. He tapped a key, bringing up a massive fractal pattern of the energy wave he had been isolating. "They aren't just shielding themselves, Sarah. They are broadcasting. And it is not a jamming signal aimed at our military satellites. It is a telemetry ping, a highly sophisticated one. They are scanning the entire biosphere, but they are completely ignoring our military installations." Sarah frowned, leaning over his shoulder to study the cascading data. "If they aren't mapping our defenses, what are they looking at?" "They are analyzing air composition, water purity, and mammalian carbon density," Elias replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "They aren't looking at our tanks or our nuclear silos. They are looking at our biology. It is almost like they are conducting an ecological audit." Before Sarah could process the implication of an alien audit, every screen in the subterranean room, every television on the surface, every smartphone, radio, and emergency frequency across the globe simultaneously hijacked itself. The fractal patterns on Elias's monitors vanished, replaced by a stark, blindingly white screen. The bunker descended into absolute suffocating silence. And then, a voice spoke. It was perfect, synthesized English, meticulously constructed by an artificial intelligence that had likely absorbed the entirety of Earth's internet in a matter of seconds. Yet, the voice was completely devoid of malice, devoid of anger, and devoid of the grandiosity one might expect from an invading conqueror. It sounded more like a disappointed archivist reading a flawed spreadsheet. Attention! We are the architects of the Great Cleansing. We have returned to Target World 84 to survey the successful sterilization of the mammalian infestation. We are currently experiencing an unprecedented error in our planetary sensors. Please stand by while we recalibrate our instruments. Your continued existence is a statistical impossibility and will be corrected shortly. The broadcast cut out, returning the screens to their previous states. In the bunker, the silence stretched out heavy and suffocating. The message did not demand the surrender of world leaders. It did not ask for Earth's resources. It treated humanity not as a worthy adversary to be conquered, but as a stubborn microscopic stain that had somehow survived a bleach treatment. Sarah clenched her jaw, her hand instinctively dropping to her sidearm, a completely useless gesture against an enemy that viewed her as a clerical error. "Sterilization?" she whispered, the color draining from her face. "What the hell are they talking about? They haven't fired a single weapon." Elias did not answer her immediately. His fingers were flying across his keyboard with frantic, desperate speed. That broadcast wasn't just audio. "Sarah," it was a carrier wave for a massive compressed data packet. They communicated with their entire fleet simultaneously using that frequency. And they didn't think we would have the primitive technology required to catch the spillover. Lines of alien code, remarkably similar to base 4 genetic sequencing, began to waterfall down his primary monitor. The supercomputers in the CDC bunker whirred in overdrive, fighting to translate the alien syntax into something comprehensible. "I am running it through the translation matrix now," Elias said, his voice tight with adrenaline. "It is a log, a historical record of their previous operations in this sector." Elias leaned closer to the screen, the pale light of the monitor casting long, sharp shadows across his face. The alien data was translating into molecular diagrams, complex chemical structures, and deep historical timeline markers. The deeper he read, the colder his blood ran. "Sarah," Elias said, his voice dropping to a hollow, disbelieving whisper. "They didn't just arrive today. They were here before, roughly 10,000 years ago." He tapped a sequence of keys, bringing up a rotating, high-definition three-dimensional model of a complex protein spike. It floated on the screen, a jagged, spherical nightmare constructed of alien mathematics. "They didn't use kinetic weapons during the first invasion," Elias explained, pointing a trembling finger at the holographic structure. "They didn't use lasers or orbital bombardments. They seeded our upper atmosphere with a biological agent, a highly contagious, incredibly fast-mutating respiratory virus. According to these logs, it was designed to wipe out every warm-blooded creature on this planet within a matter of weeks, clearing the ecosystem for whatever they plan to do with the real estate." The broadcast is right. "Sarah, by all their mathematical models, their bioweapon should have rendered us extinct millennia ago." Sarah stared at the rotating graphic on the screen, the crushing weight of a 10,000-year-old death sentence settling over the sterile room. She looked at the alien blueprint, then back at Elias. "Then why aren't we dead?" she asked. Elias looked at the alien blueprint again, a terrifyingly familiar shape forming in his mind. It was a shape he had spent his entire career studying under electron microscopes, a shape that mutated every single winter, forcing humanity into a perpetual, exhausting biological arms race. He had the answer, and the sheer absurdity of it was about to change the balance of power in the universe forever. The apocalypse did not come with fire and brimstone. It arrived 10,000 years ago as a microscopic breath. Elias Thorne sealed the heavy reinforced doors of his laboratory, effectively locking out the frantic noise of the surface world to plunge into the silent, lethal architecture of an alien mind. The CDC bunker was designed to withstand a direct nuclear strike, but at this exact moment, Elias felt entirely exposed. He was staring at a ghost from the prehistoric past, rendered in brilliant high-definition holographics on his primary workstation. He needed to understand the mechanics of the invader's arrogance. His fingers flew across the keyboard, routing the bunker's entire processing power into decrypting the alien data cache. The server towers surrounding him hummed with immense heat as they chewed through the extraterrestrial syntax. Elias isolated the core blueprints of what the alien broadcast called the ultimate cleansing agent. According to their meticulously translated logs, the invaders had seeded Earth's primitive atmosphere with a synthetic pathogen engineered to perfection. It was a fast-acting respiratory virus designed to bind specifically to mammalian cellular receptors. The logs detailed a clinical, merciless execution. The virus was meant to trigger a catastrophic cytokine storm, turning the host's own immune system against itself, liquefying lungs and suffocating every warm-blooded creature on the planet in a matter of weeks. The aliens had dropped their invisible bomb, waited for the planetary fever to burn out the infestation, and then left, marking Earth as permanently sanitized. Elias leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. The biological elegance of the alien weapon was staggering. It was a masterpiece of lethal engineering, built in a sterile laboratory light years away. But the aliens had made one fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated the sheer, brutal tenacity of Earth's ecosystem. He initiated a cross-reference protocol, piping the alien genetic sequence directly into the CDC's global pathogen database. The system algorithm began to hunt for structural matches, comparing the alien doomsday weapon against every known terrestrial virus cataloged by modern science. Elias watched the progress bar inch forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. If the aliens were returning to check their work, and if they realized humanity was still here, they might deploy a secondary weapon. He needed to know exactly what had failed the first time. The screen flashed a brilliant, blinding green. A match had been found. Elias leaned forward, his eyes scanning the data output. The monitor displayed the alien protein spike on the left and a painfully familiar human pathogen on the right. The structural homology was a 99% match. The genetic root was identical. The alien's world-ending superweapon was classified in the human database as orthomyxoviridae. A low, vibrating sound escaped Elias's chest. It took him a second to realize he was laughing. It was a dark, genuine, bubbling laughter born of sheer absurdity. The terrifying invaders hanging over Earth's cities, the architects of the Great Cleansing, had failed to exterminate humanity because of a simple biological oversight. They had introduced a pristine, static weapon into a chaotic, constantly evolving biological meat grinder. The heavy pneumatic doors of the laboratory hissed and shoved open, the security override glaring red on the keypad. General Sarah Vance strode into the room, flanked by two heavily armed tactical operatives clad in black combat gear. The automatic rifles strapped to their chests looked entirely useless against the scale of the threat hovering above the planet. But the military always needed to feel like they were holding a weapon. Sarah dismissed the guards with a sharp flick of her wrist, signaling them to wait outside. She marched toward Elias, her posture rigid. The romantic tension that used to crackle between them had long since calcified into a rigid professional barrier. But the ghost of their shared past still lingered in the narrow space between them. She had always been the unstoppable force, dragging Elias out of his reclusive tendencies. Now, she was here to drag him to a war room. "We do not have time for your mad scientist routine." "Elias," Sarah said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "the President has convened the Global Defense Council. We have representatives from NATO, the UN, and every major military power logging into a secure subterranean network. They demand the CDC's lead expert on the line in 5 minutes. We need tactical data. We need to know if these ships have biological vulnerabilities because our missiles cannot lock onto their hulls." Elias swiveled his chair around to face her, the manic grin still plastered across his face. "You want tactical data, Sarah? I have the greatest tactical data in the history of human warfare. We do not need missiles." Sarah narrowed her eyes, instantly suspicious of his demeanor. "What are you talking about? Millions of people are panicking on the surface. We have hours, maybe minutes before those monoliths open fire. Do not play games with me." "I am not playing games," Elias said, standing up and gesturing wildly to the glowing monitors behind him. "I cracked their data cache. I found the logs of their first visit to Earth. They didn't come here to observe us, Sarah. They came here to wipe us out. 10,000 years ago, they deployed a biological weapon designed to kill every mammal on this planet." Sarah stared at the screens, her tactical mind struggling to process the information. "A bioweapon? If they dropped a planet killer 10 millennia ago, why are we standing here having this conversation?" Elias tapped the screen, bringing the human pathogen into full view. "Because they built a perfect sterile weapon and dropped it into a mud pit. They didn't account for our hyper-competitive biosphere. They assumed their virus would kill the host and die off. Instead, a few early humans survived. They suffered. They burned with fever, and their immune systems produced antibodies. They passed those genetic resistances down the line. To survive, the alien virus had to mutate. To resist it, humanity had to mutate. It became a biological arms race." He stepped closer to Sarah, his eyes wide with the magnitude of the revelation. "Humanity didn't just survive their doomsday weapon. Sarah, we domesticated it. We integrated it into our ecosystem. We catch variations of it every single winter. The aliens' ultimate planet-killing bioweapon is what we call the seasonal flu." Sarah stood frozen, the color draining from her cheeks as the sheer gravity of his words hit her. "The flu," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "You are telling me the extraterrestrial threat that is currently paralyzing the globe is responsible for the common influenza virus?" "Exactly," Elias said, pacing the length of the laboratory. "It is a cosmic joke. Every time you get the chills, every time you take a sick day and drink chicken soup, you are fighting off the mutated remnants of an alien apocalypse. But here is the critical part. Sarah, look at the data. The aliens operate in a state of biological perfection. Their ships are sterile. Their technology is clean. If they designed this weapon assuming it was absolutely lethal, it means their own immune systems have absolutely zero frame of reference for how to fight it." Sarah's military mind began to pivot, discarding defensive strategies and rapidly assembling offensive possibilities. If they have no frame of reference for the original strain, they definitely have no defense against a virus that has spent 10,000 years lifting weights in the human immune system. We are walking reservoirs of their deadliest creation. Elias confirmed, his tone dropping to a serious, calculated register. Our bodies are teeming with mutated, hyper-aggressive variations of the very thing they used to try and kill us. They think they are looking at a sterile planet, They have no idea they just parked their immaculate, unshielded spaceships directly over a global petri dish. Sarah turned away from the monitors, her mind racing. The power dynamic of the impending invasion had just inverted itself completely. The Global Defense Council was preparing to beg for mercy or launch a futile, fiery last stand. They were entirely focused on the advanced armor and the unfathomable energy shielding of the alien vessels. No one was thinking about the microscopic warfare happening in every human breath. "We need to get to the Council," Sarah said, her voice finding its authoritative edge again. "The submission faction is already drafting a planetary surrender protocol. They want to wave the white flag before the aliens deploy kinetic weapons. If we walk in there with this data, we change the entire scope of the war." "We do more than change the scope," Elias said, grabbing a portable hard drive and ripping it from the console. "We have to convince a room full of terrified politicians that our greatest defense mechanism is a runny nose." Sarah looked at him, a rare, genuine spark of appreciation flashing in her eyes. It was the look she used to give him when they were younger, before the weight of the world had forced them onto different paths. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Elias? If you are wrong, and we provoke them based on a bad lab result, we accelerate the extinction of the human race." Elias tossed the hard drive in his hand, feeling the solid weight of humanity's salvation. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life. The aliens are about to find out exactly why you do not mess with Earth's biology." They walked out of the laboratory together, leaving the sterile holographic projections behind. The true battle was no longer about decoding alien syntax. It was about navigating the treacherous political waters of a terrified human command center. The invaders were hovering silently in the sky, waiting to correct their statistical error, completely unaware that the error was about to cough back. The Global Defense Council did not smell like the command center of a defiant species. It smelled like stale sweat, burnt coffee, and the sharp, metallic tang of absolute terror. Deep beneath the Pentagon, shielded by layers of reinforced steel and electromagnetic baffles, the most powerful men and women on Earth were actively losing their minds. Massive LED screens dominated the primary wall of the war room, displaying live, agonizingly static feeds of the obsidian monoliths. The ships cast long, unnatural shadows over Washington, London, Beijing, and Moscow. The subterranean chamber was a cacophony of overlapping arguments, frantic satellite reroutings, and the heavy, exhausted sighs of military commanders who knew they were completely outgunned. On the left side of the sprawling mahogany table, the submission faction was gaining terrifying momentum. Led by Secretary of State Sterling, a man whose face had taken on the color of wet ash. This group was frantically drafting a broadcast of unconditional capitulation. Sterling passionately argued that the alien hulls were absorbing nuclear targeting lasers like sponges. He insisted that any aggressive kinetic action, any launch of a missile, would result in the immediate plasma vaporization of Earth's major population centers. On the opposing side stood General Sarah Vance and her Defiance faction. Sarah slammed her hands onto the polished wood, her voice cutting through the panic like a serrated blade. She demanded they hold their ground and call the invaders bluff. She argued that submitting to an enemy who referred to humanity as an infestation was merely a polite way of volunteering for the slaughterhouse. Surrender was a myth. They were negotiating with an exterminator. The heavy vault doors at the rear of the chamber retracted smoothly. Sarah marched back into the room, cutting off Sterling mid-sentence. "Doctor." Elias Thorne trailed just behind her, looking entirely out of place among the crisp uniforms and tailored suits. He was wearing a rumpled lab coat, clutching a portable hard drive as though it were a holy relic, and sporting a distinctly unhinged, dangerous grin. Sterling immediately protested the presence of a civilian virologist in a classified, End of the world military briefing. He demanded security remove Elias from the premises. Sarah ignored him entirely. Marching to the main console and plugging Elias's hard drive directly into the central mainframes, the screens showing the invincible alien monoliths vanished in a blink, replaced by the rotating high-definition model of a deeply complex protein spike. Elias stepped up to the podium. He did not use military jargon, nor did he offer false comforts. He used hard science laced with the dark, cynical humor of a man who had just discovered the universe's greatest punchline. He explained the decrypted data cache to the room full of generals and diplomats. He walked them through the 10,000-year-old biological strike, the aliens' assumption of total planetary sterilization, and their complete lack of secondary defenses. He pointed a laser pointer at the three-dimensional rendering on the screen and introduced it as the architect's ultimate doomsday weapon. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elias announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, "and this is the apex of extraterrestrial lethality. A synthetic pathogen designed to liquefy mammalian respiratory systems and leave the planet a pristine, sterile graveyard. And I am fairly certain that Secretary Sterling here fought off a variant of this exact doomsday weapon last December with nothing but chicken soup, a warm blanket, and a few days of complaining to his staff." The room fell dead silent. Sterling stared at the virologist as if Elias had just suggested throwing rocks at the spaceships. The sheer absurdity of the claim hung in the air, thick and unbelievable. Elias leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping the humor to deliver the cold, hard reality of their situation. He explained the concept of an evolutionary arms race. He detailed how the survivors of the initial culling had passed down genetic immunities, forcing the virus to mutate, which in turn forced humanity to adapt. He declared that humanity was currently functioning as a global population of walking biological weapons of mass destruction. Every time a human breathed, they exhaled a microscopic minefield of mutated, hyper-aggressive viral strains. The sterile, hyper-advanced aliens hovering in the atmosphere had absolutely no immunological framework to process these earthly pathogens. To the invaders, Earth was not a conquered territory ripe for the taking. It was a swirling, toxic death trap of their own making. Before the submission faction could argue the scientific validity of weaponizing seasonal sniffles, the war room's communication grid locked up entirely. The screens flickered wildly, tearing through Elias's presentation, and a new broadcast overrode the global system. It was the same synthesized, flawless English from earlier, but this time, the tone was sharper, carrying the unmistakable weight of a direct, unavoidable command. The alien armada was requesting a face-to-face diplomatic summit in a designated neutral zone. They provided exact coordinates for an open-air pavilion in Geneva, Switzerland. They demanded a small human delegation arrive within 12 hours to sign a formal treaty of total planetary surrender. If humanity refused, the recalibration of their cleansing protocols would be finalized, and the skies would rain absolute fire. The politicians immediately erupted into a fresh wave of chaotic panic. Voices shouted over one another, debating the logistics of travel and the wording of a surrender document. But Sarah and Elias simply locked eyes across the noisy room. A silent, terrifying understanding passed between the general and the virologist. The aliens wanted a face-to-face meeting. They wanted to breathe the same air, separated only by their own staggering hubris and the deeply flawed assumption that the biological threat had been neutralized 10 millennia ago. Sarah approached Sterling, smoothly taking command of the delegation parameters. She agreed to the Geneva summit, promising the terrified politicians she would handle the diplomatic surrender personally to ensure no one provoked the fleet. The room breathed a collective sigh of relief, entirely misinterpreting her intentions. As Sarah pulled Elias aside into the shadow of the war room's antechamber, the true nature of her compliance became clear. They were not going to Geneva to wave a white flag or sign away the human race. They were going to weaponize the diplomatic summit without firing a single conventional bullet. They were going to deliver a payload so ancient and primitive the alien sensors would never register it as a threat. Elias rubbed his throat, feeling a very faint, familiar, scratchy tickle forming in his upper respiratory tract, leaving him to wonder just how much chaos a single, perfectly timed biological event could cause in the unshielded presence of a sterile god. The fate of 8 billion souls did not rest on the launch codes of a nuclear arsenal, but on a mild, persistent tickle at the back of a virologist's throat. The air over Geneva was crisp, alpine, and heavy with the impending doom of an entire species. The open-air pavilion situated on the shores of Lake Geneva had been hastily converted into a stage for the apocalypse. It was a beautiful, tragic juxtaposition. The pristine, freezing waters reflected the jagged, imposing silhouette of a secondary alien vessel hovering just above the cloud line, serving as a terrifying canopy for the diplomatic summit. Human military forces formed a wide, extremely nervous perimeter. Snipers lay entirely motionless on the rooftops of nearby chalets, their crosshairs trained on targets their weapons could never actually penetrate. Down in the bunkers, the Global Defense Council was watching through encrypted satellite feeds, sweating through their tailored suits, praying this surrender would buy them a few more hours of life. General Sarah Vance stood rigidly at the center of the pavilion, her dress uniform immaculate, projecting an aura of absolute unyielding stone. Beside her, Dr. Elias Thorne looked remarkably less impressive. He was wearing a slightly oversized charcoal suit borrowed from a terrified undersecretary, playing the role of a low-level diplomatic aide. He clutched a leather briefcase tightly against his chest. Inside the briefcase were dozens of pages of meaningless legal jargon, a prop designed to justify his presence on the stage, but Elias's true payload was not in his hands. It was multiplying rapidly in his sinuses. A sleek, teardrop-shaped transport detached from the hovering monolith and descended toward the pavilion without making a single sound. It touched down on the manicured grass, a masterpiece of frictionless engineering. The hull shimmered, dissolving seamlessly to reveal the alien delegation. Commander Vile stepped onto the Earth's surface. The alien leader was tall, impossibly slender, and encased in an iridescent, form-fitting garment that looked more like an exoskeleton of spun glass than a military uniform. Vile did not wear a helmet. There were no breathing apparatuses, no environmental filters. The invaders had surveyed the planet, verified the absence of advanced technological threats, and stepped out to breathe the air they firmly believed they had permanently sanitized 10 millennia ago. Vile moved with a fluid, liquid grace, treating the gravity of Earth as a minor inconvenience. Flanked by 4 elite guards wearing darker, heavily armored variations of the glass-like suits, Vile approached the human delegation. The air around the aliens carried a scent of overwhelming sterile ozone, like the interior of a freshly bleached operating room. They looked at the humans not with hatred, but with the cold, clinical disgust a homeowner might reserve for a termite infestation that had somehow survived a chemical tenting. Vile did not offer a greeting. A metallic band around the commander's pale, elongated neck pulsed with soft blue light, translating alien thought into perfect synthesized audio that echoed across the quiet pavilion. "The resilience of your biology is a statistical anomaly," Vile announced, the voice echoing with synthetic perfection. "We deployed the cleansing agent to eradicate the mammalian presence and prepare this world for colonization. Your continued survival is deeply offensive to the natural order of our mathematics. You are a resilient fungus, but an anomaly is merely an error waiting to be corrected. You will transfer total administrative control of this planet's resources, and in exchange, Your termination will be painless and swift. Sarah did not flinch. She locked eyes with the towering extraterrestrial commander, her jaw set tight. She knew Secretary Sterling was likely screaming into his headset back in Washington, demanding she kneel and sign the surrender. But Sarah was a tactician, and she was currently commanding the most dangerous soldier on the field. She shifted her weight slightly, a prearranged signal. It was a subtle gesture, a ghost of the deep, unspoken trust that had always defined her complicated relationship with Elias. Years ago, they had failed as a romantic couple because they could never agree on how to save the world. They used to argue over cheap takeout, with Sarah demanding higher defense budgets and Elias pleading for better pathogen research funding. Now, standing on the precipice of extinction, their completely opposing methodologies had finally fused into a singular, devastating strategy. She was the impenetrable shield, drawing the enemy's attention, and he was the invisible knife. Elias stepped forward from the shadows of the human delegation. He looked completely harmless. His nose was slightly red. His eyes were watering. He was experiencing the peak systemic inflammation of a completely ordinary midwinter viral infection. He had intentionally skipped his daily antihistamines, refused any decongestants, and allowed the viral load in his upper respiratory tract to flourish into a magnificent, microscopic army. He felt terrible, which meant he was incredibly lethal. "Excuse me," Elias said, his voice authentically raspy, perfectly playing the part of a terrified bureaucrat. "I have the transfer documents here, the authorization protocols required by the Global Defense Council." He fumbled with the latch of the leather briefcase, taking 2 clumsy, deliberate steps closer to Vielle and the elite guard detail. He breached the invisible perimeter of respect, entering the personal space of the alien commander. Vielle recoiled slightly, the iridescent suit shimmering in obvious revulsion at the close proximity of the biological anomaly. Elias opened his mouth to speak again, but instead, he violently inhaled. He did not try to stifle the reflex. He leaned into it. He let the fierce irritation in his nasal cavity take complete command of his diaphragm. Elias sneezed. It was not a polite, suppressed cough. It was a thunderous, wet, entirely unfiltered explosion of human biology. A massive, invisible cloud of aerosolized droplets erupted from his face, sailing directly into the faces of the alien delegation. Millions of mutated, battle-hardened viral particles, forged in the brutal crucible of human evolution over 10,000 years, slammed into the pristine, unshielded respiratory systems of a species that had never experienced a common cold. For a fraction of a second, absolutely nothing happened. The cold wind swept off the lake, rustling the fabric of the pavilion. The military snipers on the rooftops held their breath, their fingers hovering over their triggers, expecting the aliens to draw weapons of unimaginable power in retaliation for the physical insult. Instead, the elite guard standing immediately to Vial's right dropped its ceremonial weapon. The heavy glass-like staff hit the ground with a dull thud. The guard's hands flew to its own throat. A wet, horrific rattling sound emanated from the alien's chest, amplified by the translation collar into a terrifying mechanical gargle. The creature stumbled backward, its knees buckling. The sterile perfection of the alien physiology was immediately rejecting the foreign biological material. Earth's microscopic apex predators had found a completely defenseless host, and they were replicating with catastrophic speed. The guard collapsed onto the manicured grass, its chest heaving in rapid, desperate spasms. It was hyperventilating, drowning in a sudden, massive inflammatory response that its immune system had absolutely zero capacity to regulate or comprehend. The creature writhed on the ground, a deeply pathetic display of biological fragility right in front of the horrified eyes of its commander. Chaos erupted across the pavilion. The human military forces tensed, completely confused by the alien's sudden medical emergency. The other 3 guards scrambled away from Elias as if he were made of radioactive fire, their sleek weapons raised but trembling wildly. They had shields capable of deflecting ballistic missiles, but they possessed absolutely no armor against a microscopic droplet of human saliva. Vial staggered backward, the commander's arrogant composure completely shattering. The synthetic translation collar emitted a burst of harsh, terrified static as Vial looked from the writhing guard on the grass to the unassuming man in the charcoal suit. The realization of what had just occurred hit the alien commander with the force of a physical blow. The invincible armada had walked directly into a biological slaughterhouse. Elias simply pulled a crumpled tissue from his pocket, wiped his nose, and offered Vale a dark, incredibly dangerous smile. He had just fired the opening shot of a microscopic war, and the enemy was entirely unarmed. But as Vile ordered a frantic retreat to the teardrop transport, dragging the convulsing guard away, a terrifying question hung in the cold mountain air. Would the invaders retreat to their ships to die quietly from the exposure? Or would a species defined by ultimate sterility decide that the only way to cure an infected planet was to cleanse it entirely with orbital fire? The retreat of an invincible cosmic armada did not look like a calculated military maneuver. It looked like a terrified sprint from a haunted house. Vial and the surviving guards practically threw their convulsing comrade into the shimmering hull of the teardrop transport. Desperate to seal the hatch against the invisible microscopic demons of Earth, the frictionless vessel shot upward with violent, uncharacteristic haste, tearing through the cloud line and docking frantically with the colossal monolith hovering above Geneva. Down on the ground, the human military forces lowered their useless rifles, exchanging baffled glances as the sheer absurdity of the victory washed over them. Deep beneath the Pentagon, the Global Defense Council erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked cheers and frantic tactical reevaluations. Secretary Sterling collapsed into his leather chair, his face entirely devoid of color, realizing he had almost signed away the planet when a simple tissue would have sufficed. The massive LED screens dominating the war room replayed the encounter on a loop. They watched the alien guard drop its weapon. They watched it writhe on the manicured grass. The data was undeniable. Doctor. Elias Thorne was right. The invaders possessed absolute mastery over physics and energy, but their biological defenses were functionally non-existent. Hours later, the adrenaline of that microscopic victory gave way to the heavy, exhausted reality of a world still trapped under the shadows of 36 warships. The subterranean bunker was quiet, the frantic shouting replaced by the low hum of supercomputers analyzing the aftermath. Elias stood alone in the dimly lit antechamber of the laboratory, staring at a cup of lukewarm coffee as if it held the secrets of the universe. He still felt terrible. His head pounded, his sinuses ached, and his throat was raw, but he wore his symptoms like a badge of honor. The heavy pneumatic door hissed open, and General Sarah Vance stepped into the quiet space. She had discarded the rigid, immaculate jacket of her dress uniform. Her sleeves rolled up to the elbows. The impenetrable mask of the military tactician had slipped, revealing the exhausted, deeply human woman underneath. She walked over to the metal counter, poured herself a cup of the terrible coffee, and stood next to him. "Sterling is trying to take credit for the tactical deployment of your sneeze," Sarah said, her voice dropping its usual authoritative edge. He is drafting a press release for the surviving news networks claiming the State Department engineered a localized biological deterrent. Elias let out a raspy, genuine laugh, immediately wincing as the sound scraped his raw throat. "Let him have it. If the world ends tomorrow, at least the politicians will die feeling important." A comfortable, weighted silence settled between them. It was the kind of silence they had not shared in a decade. Years ago, Their relationship had fractured under the immense pressure of their conflicting worldviews. Sarah had always looked outward, seeking to build impenetrable walls and overwhelming arsenals to protect humanity from the macro threats. Elias had always looked inward, staring through microscopes at the invisible wars raging inside the human bloodstream. They had loved each other fiercely, but they had fundamentally disagreed on how to survive a hostile universe. Sarah leaned against the cold metal counter, her eyes tracing the lines of exhaustion on Elias's face. "I was so angry with you when you left the defense initiative. Elias, I thought you were hiding in your lab. I thought you were ignoring the real monsters out there." "I was looking at the real monsters." "Sarah," Elias replied softly, turning to face her. "I just knew they did not carry rifles. We spent our entire relationship arguing about armor. You wanted to build thicker plates, and I kept trying to tell you that the strongest armor we have is the scars we already carry. Our suffering built our defenses. Every fever, every plague, every miserable winter this species endured over the last 10,000 years was just target practice." She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the lapel of his rumpled, borrowed suit. The touch was entirely unexpected, a sudden spark of warmth in a room built to withstand nuclear annihilation. The end of the world had a funny way of stripping away the petty grievances of the past, leaving only the profound realization of what actually mattered. "You saved us today," Sarah said, her gaze steady and anchoring. "You stood in front of a god, and you showed it exactly how fragile perfection really is." Elias placed his hand over hers. "I did not save us. 10,000 years of human misery saved us. I just provided the delivery system. But Sarah, this is not over. Not by a long shot." Before the fragile intimacy of the moment could deepen, the antechamber's emergency communication panel flared to life. The harsh, pulsing red light painted the walls in the color of fresh panic. A young intelligence officer burst through the doors, holding a secure data pad with white-knuckled intensity. "General Vance," the officer practically shouted, completely ignoring the personal space between the two of them. "We just intercepted a massive burst of unencrypted telemetry from the alien fleet. They are panicking. The encryption protocols on their internal comms have completely collapsed." Sarah instantly snapped back into the general, her romantic vulnerability locking away behind a wall of tactical pragmatism. She snatched the datapad from the officer's hands, her eyes scanning the rapidly translating data streams. Elias stepped up beside her. "What are we looking at?" "A systemic collapse," Sarah read, her voice tight with a mixture of awe and rising dread. "The teardrop transport that fled Geneva broke their quarantine protocols. Vile dragged that infected guard directly into the hyper-sterile environment of their flagship. The pathogen is aerosolized. It is spreading through their ventilation systems." Elias rubbed his jaw, his virologist instincts calculating the math. In a completely unexposed population with zero natural antibodies, the replication rate would be catastrophic. We are not talking about a slow incubation period. Their immune systems are likely triggering massive, uncontrolled inflammatory responses, cytokine storms. The infection from Geneva is tearing through their crew like wildfire. "It gets worse," Sarah said, tapping the screen to bring up a secondary feed from Earth's deep space orbital satellites. The image displayed a thermal rendering of Vale's massive flagship. The previously cold, frictionless obsidian hull was beginning to glow with an intense, terrifying heat. Massive physical ports were opening along the underside of the vessel, revealing complex, terrifyingly large energy conduits. The same thermal blooming was occurring simultaneously across all 36 monoliths suspended around the globe. Vile was humiliated, defeated by a microscopic organism he viewed as a joke. He had watched his elite guards choke on the very air they had come to claim. The commander realized that biological warfare was a spectacular failure against a species forged in the mud and sickness of Earth. If the aliens could not breathe the atmosphere, they could not colonize the planet. And if they could not colonize it, their rigid mathematical doctrine dictated only one remaining option. They are overriding their environmental sensors, Sarah stated, the grim reality settling over the room like a physical weight. Vielle is abandoning the cleansing agent. He is authorizing a full-scale kinetic bombardment. They are going to use plasma weapons to ignite the atmosphere. Elias stared at the glowing thermal blooms on the satellite feed. His biological victory had cornered a wounded, deeply proud animal, and now that animal was preparing to lash out with the fury of a dying star. The aliens had isolated themselves, sealing their ships to prevent further contamination, but their weapons were primed to turn the surface of the Earth into glass. The human race had proven its microscopic superiority, but they still had absolutely no defense against an orbital firestorm. How could they possibly stop a fleet that had barricaded itself behind impenetrable walls? And what would it take to deliver the final lethal dose to a commander who was about to burn the world down? The sky was no longer falling. It was preparing to ignite. Earth had won the microscopic battle, but the macroscopic war was about to turn the planet into a molten cinder. Up in the freezing, silent vacuum of the exosphere, humanity's deep space telemetry satellites painted a terrifying picture of the impending apocalypse. The 36 obsidian monoliths, previously cold and frictionless, were undergoing a massive, violent transformation. Deep thermal blooms erupted along their lower ridges, bleeding brilliant hues of angry violet and blinding white into the atmosphere. The alien armada was shedding its passive observation camouflage and exposing the staggering architecture of its offensive capabilities. Massive physical ports were sliding open along the undersides of the vessels, revealing complex, terrifyingly large energy conduits that pulsed with the power of harnessed stars. Deep beneath the Pentagon, the Global Defense Council descended back into absolute, primal pandemonium. The brief, intoxicating high of the biological victory in Geneva evaporated instantly as the grim reality of an orbital plasma bombardment set in. Secretary Sterling threw his hands in the air, his face entirely devoid of color, screaming that aggravating the invaders had doomed them all. The aliens were no longer interested in a surgical, sterile culling. Commander Vielle, humiliated by his microscopic defeat and terrified by the virulent nature of Earth's atmosphere, had abandoned the precise protocols of the Great Cleansing. The invader had authorized the deployment of orbital kinetic weapons. If they could not safely breathe the air, they were going to sanitize the entire biosphere with extreme, localized fire. General Sarah Vance slammed both of her fists onto the heavy mahogany table of the war room, the sharp crack silencing the panicked politicians instantly. She refused to let humanity burn just because an extraterrestrial commander threw a temper tantrum. She pointed sharply at the glowing satellite feeds dominating the primary monitors. The alien ships were charging their plasma weapons, but that charging cycle required an immense draw of power and precious time. More importantly, to protect their crew from Earth's toxic, pathogen-rich atmosphere, the invaders had hermetically sealed their vessels. They had pulled up the drawbridges, shutting off all external vents and locking themselves inside perfectly closed, hyper-sterile environmental loops. Sarah saw the tactical vulnerability that everyone else missed. She proposed an immediate, highly classified boarding operation. They were going to send a single elite strike team straight up the gravity well to breach Vielle's flagship hovering over Geneva. Sterling scoffed at the idea, his voice trembling with exhausted disbelief. He pointed out that conventional explosives, bunker busters, and even low-yield nuclear warheads had already proven entirely useless against the alien energy shielding. A human strike team carrying high explosives would be nothing but a minor, irritating pest before the planet was turned to glass. Sarah offered the terrified politician a cold, predatory smile. She explained that her tactical team was not taking explosives. They were not loading armor-piercing rounds or incendiary grenades. They were taking ammunition forged by 10,000 years of human survival in the deepest, most secure cold storage vaults of the CDC. Humanity possessed highly concentrated, weaponized strains of the influenza virus, harvested from the most brutal and lethal winter seasons on record. They were going to load heavy, pressurized tactical canisters with raw flu cultures, human biological samples, unfiltered organic matter, and concentrated sweat. It was a completely organic, highly aggressive, dirty bomb. The strike team was going to breach the flagship, locate the environmental controls, and hook the brutal reality of the human condition directly into the alien life support systems. The war room fell completely silent at the sheer audacity of the plan. It was brilliant, profoundly disgusting, and completely unprecedented in the history of warfare. But as the generals began to nod in slow realization, a glaring logistical flaw emerged. Elias Thorne stepped away from the shadowed back wall of the chamber and approached the center table. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the most powerful military leaders on Earth. He pointed out that while highly trained Special Forces operators knew exactly how to breach a steel bulkhead or clear a room of hostile combatants, they had absolutely no idea how to navigate the fluid dynamics of a hyper-advanced, extraterrestrial environmental scrubber. If a soldier simply vented the biological payload in a random standard corridor, the ship's localized, automated filtration systems would likely isolate and neutralize the threat before it ever reached the command deck. They needed to hit the primary distribution hub. They needed to find the anatomical equivalent of the alien ship's lungs. And only a virologist with a deep understanding of airborne pathogenic distribution could identify the right target. Elias planted his hands on the table and declared that he was joining the tactical strike team. Sarah immediately objected. Her professional, unshakable demeanor cracked right down the middle, revealing the raw, fiercely protective woman beneath the uniform. She marched around the table, getting directly into his personal space. She argued fiercely that Elias was a scientist, a man who spent his life peering through microscopes, not a soldier trained for high-altitude combat. Sending an unarmed civilian onto a hostile, fully mobilized alien warship was a guaranteed death sentence. Elias did not back down. He stood his ground, looking her squarely in the eyes. The weight of their shared, complicated history hung heavily in the air between them. He reminded her of the endless arguments they used to have about how to save the world. They had spent their entire lives fighting on different fronts, but this was the exact moment their separate wars finally merged into one. "I am the weapon, Sarah," Elias said, his voice steady and resolute, carrying none of his usual cynical humor. "And you are the tactician delivering me to the target. Without me, that payload goes into the wrong vent. The virus gets scrubbed and the Earth burns. You know I have to go." Sarah held his gaze for a long, agonizing moment. The war room watched the silent exchange, witnessing the collision of military duty and profound personal sacrifice. Sarah saw the absolute unyielding certainty in his eyes. She knew he was right. She finally gave a curt, tight nod, stepping back and swallowing the heavy lump in her throat. The operation was officially greenlit. They had less than 2 hours before the alien kinetic weapons reached critical mass and began their orbital bombardment. Deep within a classified underground hangar, the reality of the mission began to take shape. A sleek, radar-absorbent stealth transport craft was prepped for immediate vertical launch. Hardened, elite operatives clad in heavy tactical gear moved with practiced efficiency, loading heavy pressurized steel tanks onto the vessel. The canisters were marked with bright biohazard warnings, filled to the brim with a slurry of humanity's most common, most irritating microscopic nightmares. Elias strapped himself into a jump seat, his heart hammering against his ribs, clutching a pressurized delivery nozzle that looked entirely too heavy for him. They were about to launch a desperate, near-suicidal vertical assault against an enemy that possessed unimaginable firepower and a profound hatred for their existence. The success of the entire human race relied heavily on their ability to stay alive long enough to turn a valve. But as the hangar doors scraped open to reveal the glowing, angry sky, a terrifying question remained. How would a team of human soldiers even begin to penetrate a massive warship that had completely barricaded itself against the very air they breathed? And what horrors awaited them in the pristine corridors of the enemy? The stealth transport did not fly into the belly of the alien dreadnought. It crawled up its throat like a jagged, rusted pill. High above the panicked streets of Geneva, concealed from thermal sensors by experimental metamaterials, the human boarding craft matched the exact geostationary rotation of Vial's flagship. The exterior of the colossal obsidian monolith was radiating intense, terrifying heat as its orbital kinetic weapons continued their slow, methodical charging cycle. Inside the cramped troop compartment, Dr. Elias Thorne gripped his restraining harness until his knuckles turned entirely white. Beside him, General Sarah Vance and her elite strike team sat in stone-cold silence. Their weapons checked, their biocanisters secured. They were riding a makeshift elevator to hell, and their only defense was a highly concentrated batch of seasonal misery. The transport made physical contact with a secondary engineering airlock on the flagship's lower hull. There was a dull, heavy vibration as magnetic grapples slammed into place, anchoring the small human vessel against the sheer mass of the alien warship. A specialized plasma torch engaged, melting through the extraterrestrial alloy with agonizing slowness. When the breach was finally complete, the heavy pressurized doors of the transport hissed open, revealing the interior of the enemy stronghold. Stepping onto the alien flagship was a deeply profound sensory shock. The human team breached the airlock and immediately entered an environment that defied every natural law of Earth. The corridors were vast, sweeping and illuminated by a soft, shadowless luminescence that seemed to emanate directly from the smooth, pearl-white walls. There were no visible light fixtures, no exposed wiring, and absolutely no sharp corners. But the most jarring element was the atmosphere itself. Elias took a breath through his tactical respirator and tasted absolute, unyielding nothingness. The air was hyper-purified, smelling faintly of synthetic ozone and mathematical perfection. There was not a single speck of dust dancing in the light. It was an environment completely devoid of microscopic competition, a grand cathedral-like surgical theater scaled to the size of a floating city. To a virologist, it was the most unnatural, terrifying place in the universe. It was a biological vacuum waiting to be violently filled. Sarah signaled the strike team with sharp, precise hand gestures. They moved forward in a tight tactical diamond, their boots making no sound on the frictionless floor. They did not carry standard armor-piercing ammunition. Their customized rifles were loaded with specialized microfilament darts. The objective was not to cause massive internal trauma. The objective was merely to puncture. They encountered their first alien patrol at the intersection of a massive, sweeping concourse. 4 extraterrestrial guards, tall and graceful, were encased in the same shimmering glass-like environmental suits Vial had worn on the surface. They moved with the confident arrogance of a species that had conquered the stars. Sarah did not hesitate. She did not aim for center mass or attempt to penetrate the thickest parts of their alien armor. She raised her rifle and fired a synchronized volley directly at the flexible joints of the lead guard's suit. The microfilament darts struck true, piercing the iridescent material with microscopic precision. The physical impact was negligible, barely registering as a stumble for the massive alien soldier. But the true payload was instantly delivered. The microscopic tears in the suit compromised the hyper-sterile internal environment, allowing the ambient air of the corridor to rush in. And that ambient air had just been contaminated by the simple, unavoidable presence of sweating, breathing human soldiers. The reaction was instantaneous and horrifying to witness. The alien guard dropped its elegant energy weapon, its hands flying to its throat. The creature collapsed to the pristine floor, convulsing wildly as its completely unexposed immune system short-circuited in a matter of seconds. It was drowning in a violent inflammatory response triggered by a mild human rhinovirus. The other three guards turned in utter confusion, raising their weapons toward the human intruders. Sarah's team fired again, targeting the suits. Within moments, the entire patrol lay writhing on the flawless white floor, incapacitated by an invisible airborne enemy they could not shoot, arrest, or understand. It was a bizarre, darkly humorous, and profoundly quiet kind of warfare. The human soldiers stepped carefully over the convulsing forms, leaving their dirty microscopic footprints across the sterile kingdom. Elias checked the modified telemetry scanner strapped to his wrist. The device was tracing the massive atmospheric currents flowing through the ship's walls. He pointed down a vast, descending ramp, guiding the team deeper into the belly of the vessel. The flagship groaned around them, a deep, resonant vibration that signaled the orbital weapons were reaching critical mass. Time was rapidly evaporating. They finally reached the primary life support distribution hub. It was a breathtaking chamber of enormous proportions, serving as the mechanical lungs of the entire fleet. Massive, transparent crystalline tubes pulsed with glowing, sterilized gases, pumping breathable atmosphere to every deck of the monolithic ship. At the center of the room sat the primary intake manifold, a complex array of shimmering valves and heavy biological scrubbers designed to ensure absolute purity. Elias hauled the heavy steel canisters forward. They were ugly, dented, and plastered with aggressive yellow biohazard stickers, providing a stark, ugly contrast to the surrounding alien elegance. He dropped to his knees in front of the manifold and began the frantic, complicated process of a manual override. He had to bypass the ship's localized filtration safeguards, connecting the heavy hoses of his pressurized tanks directly into the central circulation vein. Sarah established a defensive perimeter, her eyes scanning the sweeping entryways of the hub. She watched Elias work, his hands flying across the alien console, sweating profusely under the weight of his tactical gear. He was a man out of his element, a scientist holding the literal apocalypse in a metal jug, yet he moved with absolute terrifying purpose. He locked the heavy clamps into place, securing the delivery nozzles to the alien machinery. The payload of concentrated influenza, human sweat, and mutated viral strains was primed and ready to flood the entire flagship. "I have the bypass locked," Elias called out, his voice echoing in the massive chamber. "If I pull this release lever, the payload hits the main circulation fans. It will be in every corridor, every barracks, and on the bridge in under 90 seconds. He reached for the heavy red release lever, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal. Before he could apply the necessary pressure, the shadowless pearl-white light of the cathedral violently shifted to a harsh, blinding crimson. The ship's internal security alarm shrieked, a high-pitched, synthetic wail that rattled the teeth in Elias's skull. Searing beams of superheated plasma tore through the space from the upper observation tiers, instantly melting the crystalline structures near the entrance and vaporizing the cover Sarah's squad was using. The air, previously smelling of ozone, instantly filled with the acrid stench of scorched metal. Commander Vile stepped out from an elevated platform, completely discarding the fragile, iridescent diplomat suit. The alien leader was now encased in a massive, aggressive combat rig, plated in heavy dark armor and carrying a repeating plasma cannon. Vial was flanked by a dozen heavily armored royal guards, the absolute elite of the armada, completely sealed against the biological threat. The ambush was overwhelming. The plasma fire rained down with devastating precision. Sarah and her team were instantly pinned behind the structural supports of the lower deck, unable to return fire without risking a stray shot rupturing the biological canisters. If the pressurized tanks were destroyed in the open room, the localized scrubbers would neutralize the virus before it ever reached the ventilation system, rendering the entire mission a failure. Sarah shouted orders over the deafening roar of the alien weapons, trying to organize a suppressing fire pattern. But the royal guards were too fast and entirely too powerful. Two colossal alien soldiers dropped directly from the upper tier, landing with earth-shattering force just feet away from the central manifold. They closed the distance to Elias in the blink of an eye. Elias desperately yanked on the release lever, but an armored, gauntleted hand the size of a cinder block clamped down on his wrist. The alien guard lifted Elias entirely off the floor by his throat, effortlessly ripping him away from the manifold. The virologist kicked and struggled, gasping for air as the crushing grip tightened. The other guard stepped forward, raising its weapon and completely blocking access to the tanks. The biological payload sat firmly attached to the ship's lungs. The valve agonizingly closed, while the architect of the alien's microscopic nightmare dangled helplessly in the grip of a furious god. The difference between a conqueror and a survivor is that the conqueror expects a clean victory, while the survivor simply refuses to die quietly, dangling by his throat in the sterile, blinding light of an extraterrestrial warship. Doctor. Elias Thorne was about to demonstrate the sheer, ugly tenacity of the human race. The colossal alien guard held Elias effortlessly suspended above the polished floor of the primary life support hub. His tactical gear felt incredibly heavy, and his vision swam with black spots as the armored gauntlet compressed his carotid artery. Below him, General Sarah Vance and her elite strike team were pinned tightly behind the melted remains of a crystalline structural support. Completely immobilized by the searing, relentless crossfire of repeating plasma cannons, the operation was effectively paralyzed. Commander Vial stepped down from the elevated observation platform, his massive, dark combat rig absorbing the ambient light of the room like a localized black hole. The alien leader approached the central manifold, waving a gauntleted hand to signal a temporary ceasefire. The deafening roar of the plasma weapons abruptly ceased, replaced by the terrifying low-frequency hum of the flagship's orbital cannons reaching their final charging sequence. Vial tapped a sequence on a floating holographic terminal. Above them, a massive translucent display flared to life, projecting a highly detailed thermal map of Earth. The 36 monoliths were glowing with an angry, volatile violet hue. A series of harsh, angular alien symbols began rapidly counting down in the corner of the projection. 5 of your planetary minutes. Vial's voice boomed through the external synthesizers of his heavy armor, the translation software perfectly capturing the cold, venomous arrogance of his tone. That is the precise duration remaining before our kinetic batteries reach absolute capacity. We will ignite the upper layers of your atmosphere, turning the oxygen you breathe into an expanding wave of molecular fire. Your oceans will boil. Your cities will melt into the bedrock. You are nothing but a stubborn, disgusting fungus, clinging to a rock that belongs to us. I will personally supervise the sterilization of this infestation. Elias clawed desperately at the massive hand crushing his windpipe. He managed to pry the alien's thumb back just a fraction of an inch, allowing a thin, agonizing trickle of air into his lungs. He did not beg for his life. He did not plead for the billions of souls currently staring up at the burning sky. Instead, he forced a bloody, defiant grin onto his face. You do not understand a single thing about this planet. Elias choked out, his voice a raspy, damaged wheeze that echoed surprisingly loud in the sudden quiet of the cathedral-like space. You look at us and see a disease. You think your sterile ships and your perfect, unblemished biology make you invincible. But your perfection is exactly what makes you so incredibly fragile. Vile tilted his armored head, genuinely confused by the bravado of a dying, primitive mammal. He stepped closer, towering over the suspended virologist. And we have mastered the fundamental physics of the universe. We conquer stars. You succumb to microscopic parasites in your own drinking water. Exactly, Elias fired back, the dark humor returning to his voice despite the agonizing pain in his neck. We are born in the mud. We grow up running fevers. We survive plagues, infections, and brutal freezing winters. Our entire evolutionary history is defined by suffering and microscopic warfare. Every scar, every sickness, every miserable biological struggle this species has ever endured forged us into an absolute nightmare for a creature like you. We are not a fungus, Vial. We are the immune system of Earth, and you just marched directly into the white blood cells. Vial let out a synthesized metallic scoff, entirely dismissing the philosophical argument. He turned his back on Elias, raising a hand to order the execution of the human strike team. That single moment of supreme dismissive arrogance was the only opening Elias needed. He had spent the last 2 minutes mapping the alien console with his eyes while pretending to be entirely helpless. He knew the heavy combat rigs of the Royal Guard were tied directly into the room's environmental network to maintain their internal, sterile pressurization. He swung his body weight violently backward, using the alien guard's crushing grip as a fulcrum. He brought his heavy combat boot up and slammed the reinforced steel toe directly into the master environmental override terminal on the central console. The flawless pearl-white lighting of the hub instantly plunged into a chaotic, strobing emergency amber. A deafening mechanical shriek tore through the chamber. Elias had not triggered the biological payload. He had initiated a catastrophic localized depressurization sequence. The ship's automated defense protocols reacted instantly to the perceived atmospheric breach, to prevent the massive combat rigs from imploding due to the sudden shift in external pressure. The armor's internal computers executed an emergency equalization protocol. The heavy hermetic seals on Vial's helmet and the helmets of every elite guard in the room violently hissed and popped open, exposing their faces to the ambient air of the command deck. They were unshielded before the alien commander could process the catastrophic vulnerability. Elias reached up with his free hand and ripped the tactical respirator entirely off his own face. He inhaled a deep, ragged breath of the newly mixed atmosphere, pulling the raw, aching irritation from deep within his infected chest. Elias coughed. It was a brutal, wet, entirely unrestricted cough, launched from less than 2 feet away directly into the unsealed, horrified face of Commander Vial. An invisible, densely concentrated cloud of pure human pathogen, incubated in a stressed, adrenaline-filled virologist, washed over the alien leader. The effect was immediate, devastating, and far more violent than the encounter in Geneva. The pristine, absolutely defenseless immune system of the extraterrestrial conqueror recognized the massive foreign biological invasion and instantly deployed every defensive countermeasure it possessed simultaneously. Vial dropped his plasma cannon. The towering commander collapsed to his knees, his hands tearing frantically at his own throat. A horrifying, wet gargle erupted from his mouth as a massive cytokine storm liquefied his upper respiratory tract in a matter of seconds. His body arched backward in a brutal, paralyzing convulsion. The elite guard holding Elias experienced the exact same catastrophic biological short-circuit, inhaling the microscopic fallout from the virologist's breath. The crushing grip on Elias's throat vanished instantly. The massive alien soldier collapsed like a felled redwood, writhing on the frictionless floor, entirely consumed by a violent, hyper-accelerated fever. Across the hub, the remaining royal guards began dropping their weapons, staggering blindly as the ambient viral load introduced by the unsealed humans swept through the room. Their superior technology, their impenetrable armor, and their mastery over the stars meant absolutely nothing against the brutal, unforgiving reality of a human rhinovirus. Sarah Vance did not waste a single millisecond of the resulting chaos. She vaulted over the melted crystalline cover, her tactical rifle raised, sprinting across the open floor with her strike team right behind her. They ignored the convulsing, incapacitated alien guards. Sarah reached Elias, who was currently slumped against the central console, gasping for air and massaging his severely bruised neck. She grabbed him by the tactical vest and hauled him to his feet. Without a word, she stepped past him, grasped the heavy red release lever on the biological tanks, and slammed it downward with all of her strength. A massive, heavy hiss echoed through the chamber as the pressurized steel canisters emptied their payload directly into the flagship's primary circulation veins. Millions of gallons of highly concentrated, weaponized influenza, laced with humanity's most aggressive organic matter, surged through the transparent tubes, rushing toward every single deck, barracks, and command center of the Obsidian dreadnought. It was only a matter of time before the rapidly multiplying pathogen found a way to bridge the communication gaps between the flagship and the rest of the fleet, or before the panicked alien crews simply opened their airlocks in a desperate attempt to flee the invisible fire. Sarah turned to the primary command terminal. The thermal map of Earth was still glowing, the countdown timer ticking dangerously close to zero. She raised her rifle and smashed the butt of the weapon directly into the crystalline interface, shattering the command node and physically severing the power routing from the central hub to the orbital kinetic batteries. The deep resonant vibration of the flagship abruptly died. The blinding violet thermal blooms on the tactical display flickered and faded to a dull, harmless gray. The sky was no longer going to burn. The human strike team stood in the heart of the most advanced warship in the galaxy, surrounded by the convulsing bodies of fallen gods, breathing the heavily contaminated air of total victory, leaving humanity to wonder exactly what they would do with 36 heavily armed, completely quarantined spaceships floating in their upper atmosphere. The quietest surrenders in the history of the universe are not signed with ink on parchment, but gasped through the fevered, desperate breaths of a shattered empire. Inside the colossal Obsidian flagship, the silence of the hyper-sterile corridors was broken only by the rhythmic, terrifying hiss of the primary ventilation scrubbers failing to contain the biological payload. The heavy steel canisters Elias had attached to the central manifold pumped millions of cubic feet of weaponized human influenza directly into the vessel's artificial lungs. The microscopic invaders swept through the crystalline tubes, riding the perfectly regulated atmospheric currents into every barracks, every command center, and every pristine meditation chamber on the ship. The effect on the completely unexposed alien crew was catastrophic and immediate. The majestic, glass-like environmental suits that had protected the invaders for millennia became their tombs. As the aerosolized virus breached their localized life support systems, thousands of elite extraterrestrial soldiers collapsed. They experienced severe cytokine storms, their pure, untested immune systems entirely overreacting to the sudden presence of a foreign pathogen. Viel, the supreme commander who had intended to ignite the atmosphere, lay completely incapacitated on the floor of the life support hub, drowning in a violent fever caused by a simple human sneeze. The flagship's automated medical sensors immediately began broadcasting frantic, unencrypted distress telemetry to the other 35 monoliths suspended around the globe. The commanders of the remaining armada watched in absolute horror as the biometric data of their most heavily armored, technologically invincible flagship flatlined in a matter of minutes. The tactical reality was undeniable. They possessed the firepower to turn Earth into a molten sphere of glass. But they could not fire their orbital kinetic weapons without opening their defensive thermal ports. Opening those ports meant exposing their internal atmospheres to the highly contagious airborne death traps swirling around them. Earth was no longer a target. It was a cosmic biohazard. Deep beneath the Pentagon, the heavy, suffocating tension of the Global Defense Council was broken by a sudden, universally broadcast transmission. Secretary Sterling stared at the massive LED screens as the 35 remaining monoliths simultaneously powered down their weapons. The angry violet thermal blooms faded into a dull, defeated gray. The synthesized, flawless English voice returned to the war room, but the arrogant, clinical tone was entirely gone. It was replaced by a desperate, formal request for immediate, unconditional capitulation. The invaders agreed to relinquish their planetary claims, surrender their navigational technology, and submit to human quarantine protocols in exchange for a medical cessation of hostilities. Humanity had not fired a single nuclear warhead. They had not launched a single fighter jet. They had simply stood their ground, breathed the air, and allowed 10,000 years of biological misery to do the fighting for them. The aftermath of the microscopic war fundamentally rewrote the dynamic of the cosmos. Earth was no longer a fragile, primitive speck waiting to be conquered by advanced civilizations. Humanity had accidentally established itself as the undisputed apex biological predator of the galaxy. The stars were filled with sterile, flawless empires, but those empires were terrified of the mud, the grime, and the hyper-aggressive microscopic warriors that humans carried in their bloodstreams every single day. The question of what humanity would do with the surrendered alien technology, and how the rest of the universe would react to a species of walking bioweapons taking to the stars, hung heavily in the newly liberated sky. 6 months after the Great Invasion was halted, the skies over Geneva were clear, crisp, and wonderfully normal. General Sarah Vance stood on the sweeping balcony of a newly constructed global defense diplomatic facility, the cold alpine wind catching the edge of her civilian coat. She held a steaming mug of coffee, watching the horizon, high above the atmosphere. The dark silhouettes of the alien monoliths were being peacefully escorted toward a deep space quarantine zone by a fleet of human-piloted, reverse-engineered frigates. The invaders were leaving, their sterile arrogance permanently broken by the sheer resilience of Earth. Doctor. Elias Thorne stepped onto the balcony, moving with a relaxed, easy gait that had been entirely absent during their subterranean confinement. He did not look like a man who had stared down an alien god and delivered an apocalyptic payload. He looked like a scientist who had finally gotten a full night of sleep. He carried 2 thick, woolen blankets, draping one comfortably over Sarah's shoulders before leaning against the stone railing beside her. The deep, fracturing rifts that had once destroyed their relationship were completely gone. The end of the world had stripped away their ideological differences, leaving behind a profound, unshakable partnership. They had spent their lives arguing about the best way to build armor for humanity, only to realize they were both right. Sarah provided the tactical shield, and Elias provided the invisible sword. Sterling is still trying to get his face on the new currency, Elias said, a warm, genuine smile touching the corners of his eyes. He claims his diplomatic stalling tactics in the war room were the true key to wearing down the alien morale. Sarah let out a soft, echoing laugh, leaning her head gently against Elias's shoulder. Let him spin his stories. The history books will know the truth. They will know that a virologist with a head cold saved 8 billion lives. They stood together in the quiet, freezing air, watching the last of the alien dreadnoughts shrink into tiny, insignificant specks against the vastness of the cosmos. The universe is a hostile, terrifying place, filled with empires that seek absolute perfection. They build frictionless ships. They synthesize flawless intelligence, and they eradicate anything that does not fit into their pristine mathematical models. But true strength does not come from remaining unblemished. Real enduring power is not found in avoiding pain or living in a hyper-sterile bubble. True strength is born in the mud. It is forged through suffering, through fevers, and through the brutal, exhausting process of surviving a world that constantly tries to break you. Humanity is a species defined by its scars. We absorb the toxicity of our environment. We fight it, we adapt to it, and we emerge exponentially stronger. The aliens brought an ultimate bioweapon to Earth, expecting to find victims. Instead, they found a planet full of survivors who had turned their greatest curse into an impenetrable shield. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed this journey into the microscopic warfare of the cosmos, please make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves a good sci-fi twist. I want to hear from you in the comments. So leave the word antibody down below to let me know you made it all the way to the end. And do not forget to hit that hype button so this video reaches more viewers who appreciate a story where humanity actually wins the day. Stay resilient. Stay curious. And I will see you in the next adventure.